to represent the United States at a foreign event. Sometimes it's an inauguration, sometimes it's a coronation, sometimes it's a funeral. That will not be taking place this time, but the United States will be represented at the event by our top diplomat on the island and by a senior White House official who will be traveling to Cuba.
What was the thinking behind not designating a formal delegation?
Well, obviously, Josh, so much of the U.S. diplomatic relationship with Cuba is quite complicated. There are many aspects of the U.S.-Cuba relationship were characterized by a lot of conflict and turmoil, not just during the Castro regime, but we continue to have some significant concerns about the way the Cuban government currently operates, particularly with regard to protecting the basic human rights of the Cuban people. So we believe that this was an appropriate way for the United States to show our commitment to an ongoing, future-oriented relationship with the Cuban people. And this is an appropriate way to show respect, to participate in the events that are planned for this evening, while also acknowledging some of the differences that remain between our two countries.
Josh, does the president view flag burning to be a protected act of free speech, and does he feel that it should remain that way?
The freedom that we all have to express ourselves in the way that we choose to do so is protected by the United States Constitution. Similar freedoms related to the practice of religion, speech, the institution of journalism are also enshrined in our Constitution and are worth protecting. The need to protect those rights is in place to protect speech and expression, not just when we agree with it, but also when we find it offensive. Many Americans, the vast majority of Americans, myself included, find the burning of the flag offensive. But we have a responsibility as a country to carefully protect our rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. I know that this is a bipartisan sentiment. I know that there are conservatives on the Supreme Court that share the view that I've just articulated. I know that there are Democrats and Republicans in the United States Congress that share the view that I've just articulated. And it certainly is consistent with the kind of governing agenda that President Obama has pursued here in the White House during his 8 years in the Oval Office.
You cast the right to burn the flag if one chooses to do so as part of a broader set of basic freedoms. You mentioned freedom of the press and others. Is it fair then to say that the president is concerned when he sees the president-elect saying, we need to remove citizenship from people who, choose to engage in that activity, about rolling back of some basic freedoms under the next administration?
Josh, I'll just make an observation that many of you have made, which is that this is not the first thing that the president-elect has said or tweeted that President Obama disagrees with. So I will let the president-elect and his team discuss the words that populate his Twitter feed. They can explain or defend those positions or those views. What I can do is my best to articulate to you the president's views and the priority that he places on a smooth and effective transition. And if I spend our daily interactions here itemizing and criticizing all of the things that the president-elect does that are different than what President Obama has done, that is going to materially undermine our ability to engage in a smooth and effective transition. And since that's the priority right now, since the election was held, I'll let the president-elect's team speak to the wisdom and views and policy positions that are articulated by the president-elect.
And just lastly, policy aside, a number of times in the last week or so, you've noted that the method that these positions have come out from the president-elect have been Twitter. Are you suggesting that maybe it would be wiser, given the stature of the office, for the president-elect to be tweeting less, or to be finding another way to sort of communicate some of these positions?
I don't mean to do that. I think in what I've observed is that since the election, this seems to have been the principal method that the president-elect has used to communicate with the American public and to communicate with all of you, with the exception of at least one off-the-record meeting that he held with journalists in New York last week. So I don't mean to make that reference pejoratively, because the truth is President Obama has found Twitter to be a useful mechanism for communicating with the American public and providing some insight to all of you about what he's thinking about. At the same time, President Obama has not relied just on Twitter to communicate with the American public and interact with all of you. Over the course of the president's foreign trip, for example, when he traveled around the world, meeting with world leaders, talking about some of our highest national security priorities, the president, over the course of that trip, convened 3 different news conferences to answer your questions and to speak to all of you about those meetings and about the way that he was representing and advancing our interests around the globe. Interacting in that form with the independent media is not just valuable, it also is part of the job. And President Obama takes that part of his job quite seriously. And that's something that we've done extensively during his time here in office. But obviously the president-elect and his team will have to develop a communication strategy that they believe is most effective to informing the American public, and is also consistent with the expectations that the American people have about transparency and accountability for those in positions of authority. And part of that is an individual in a position of authority submitting or even subjecting themselves to skeptical questioning from an independent news media. And that's a valuable and critically important part of our democracy, and in fact the success of our democracy depends on it.
Thanks.
Roberta?
The president-elect is going to name or nominate Congressman Price as his HHS secretary. And Congressman Price has for a long time been promoting an alternative to Obamacare. And I'm wondering what the White House's assessment is of his ideas about the alternatives that he has presented to Obamacare.
I don't know if a formal announcement has come from the president-elect's team, but there has been one.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is clear is that the president-elect has chosen to nominate someone to be his Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is an ardent opponent of the Affordable Care Act, and somebody who says he is committed to repealing it. We've heard comments from the president-elect and from the Congressman Price about some of the ideas that they say would work if implemented. And I spent a little time working with my staff today to develop what I think are some metrics that all of you and the American public should apply in evaluating some of the proposals that may be put forward by the other side. Here's why this is important. Since the day the president signed the Affordable Care Act into law in March of 2010, he indicated an openness to working with Republicans or Democrats to implement ideas for further strengthening the law. So the president has always welcomed good ideas, either from Democrats or Republicans, to strengthen the law. The problem has been that the only kinds of ideas that have been put forward by the Republicans, to the extent that they've put forward any ideas, and there have not been many, but when they have, they actually have been ideas for undermining the law, not strengthening it. And those were primarily methods of political communication, making a political argument, not for actually governing the country. But as the president observed in the context of a couple of those news conferences I referred to earlier, reality has a way of intruding once you enter the Oval Office and you assume the awesome responsibility of governing the greatest country in the world. So, I'll move expeditiously here, but I can whittle it down to 5 metrics that you can use to evaluate their proposal. And I think what you should measure it against is the progress that we've made through the Affordable Care Act in the 6 years or so that it's been in effect. So let's start. Number one, this is the one that you guys have written about the most. Since the Affordable Care Act went into effect, 20 million Americans have gotten health insurance. And according to a recent survey, 91.1% of Americans now has health insurance. That is an insured rate that's higher than it's ever been. So when these new ideas come forward, it's important to evaluate whether or not, what impact that would have on the percentage of Americans that have health insurance. Because after all, expanding access to health care coverage was one of the principal goals of the Affordable Care Act. Number two, another principal goal of the Affordable Care Act was holding down the rapid growth in health care costs. And this was a problem that has bedeviled policymakers for at least a generation, is that the growth in health care costs was higher than the growth of other aspects of our economy. And the Affordable Care Act has actually had a positive impact in holding down that growth in healthcare costs. And let me just give you the best metric to evaluate. In 2016, fiscal year 2016, which just ended a couple of months ago, the growth in employer-based health insurance premiums was 3.4%. That is much lower than it was before the Affordable Care Act went into effect. In fact, between 2010 and the decade before the Affordable Care Act went into effect, employer premiums grew on average of about 7.9%. So we've cut the growth in healthcare costs by more than half. So again, evaluating the proposals from the other side should take a look at what impact they have in limiting the growth in healthcare costs. And again, in 2016, the growth in employer-based insurance premiums was 3.4%, which is at or near all-time lows. The third thing that is among the benefits of the Affordable Care Act are a whole range of consumer protections, many of which even Republicans say that they like. So the proposals put forward by the other side should be evaluated that they are women. Before the Affordable Care Act went into place, many Americans were subject to lifetime limits on the benefits they could collect from their insurance company. The problem for many families is that if kids were sick at an early age, by age 10 or so, they would consumer protections that are now in place. The other one that's gotten a lot of attention is that thanks to the Affordable Care Act, young Americans can stay on their parents' insurance until age 26. And that provides an important buffer for many young Americans when they get out of college, before they get settled in a job over the long term. They can enjoy the protection of being on their parents' health insurance. So another consumer protection enjoyed and praised by Democrats and Republicans. We'll see if Republicans can do the important work to keep it, and their ability to do so, it should be part of the way in which their proposals are evaluated. Just two more. The first is, what impact will the law have on Medicare? Out of money by 2017. 2017 is a month from now. And the life of Medicare has been extended because of the Affordable Care Act by more than a decade. So it certainly will be important to ask questions if and when there is a proposal from the other side, what impact their plan will have on strengthening Medicare. And the last thing, and I cite this only because this is what Republicans most like to talk about, and that's the deficit. what impact will their proposal have on the deficit? What I can tell you that the CBO has concluded is that the impact of the Affordable Care Act on the deficit is to reduce the deficit by $3 trillion in the next 20 years. Trillion with a T. A $3 trillion reduction in the deficit over the next 20 years. So that certainly sets a pretty high bar for evaluating the budget impact of a proposal from the other side, but that is an important metric, one that Republicans have long prioritized, and if and when they put forward their own proposal, it should be measured against the kind of progress that the country has made under Obamacare. So I appreciate you indulging me with the long answer, but this is the kind of thing that I can certainly understand why this may not end up in the stories about Congressman Price's nomination today. But at some point, if he makes good on his word, at some point, maybe in the next year or so, he will be standing at this podium, in this room, in front of all of you, unveiling a new health care plan. And so I hope I'll be counting on all of you to just take a look at my notes, and if you or take a look at the notes from this briefing, and maybe it could serve as some questions that are worth asking about the new proposal.
So I don't want to go on too long.
I already have, which I apologize.